Tunisia, May 1943. The heat in North Africa had a way of breaking men not through violence but through exhaustion. It was May 9th, 1943, 2 days before the Axis surrender in Tunisia. The desert air shimmered above the dunes like a mirage. The smoke from burning half-tracks mixed with the scent of oil and blood. Gefreiter Karl Weber, age 21, stumbled forward with his rifle slung upside down, the barrel pointed toward the sand. He'd been fighting with the 10th Panzer Division, part of the German Afrika Korps, under remnants of Rommel's command. Now what was left of his unit, maybe 40 men, were walking toward an American line, waving a white scrap of cloth torn from a field dressing. Behind him, the thunder of artillery was finally gone. Only the sound of boots crunching in sand, the groan of engines, and the occasional buzz of flies. He could see the American position ahead, sandbags, tents, and vehicles painted in that odd, greenish-gray color that looked almost peaceful under the desert sun. A soldier raised a hand and shouted in English. Karl couldn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. Stop. Don't do anything stupid. They halted, dropped their weapons, and raised their hands. From behind a half-track marked with a white star, Private First Class Joe Dawson stepped out, sweat streaming down his face. His uniform was dusty, his helmet askew. He was 23, a farm boy from Kansas, who'd never seen a desert before, 6 months ago. The sight before him was surreal, dozens of Germans, some in field-gray tunics, some shirtless and sunburned, all beaten not by bullets, but by the sun and time. Jesus, he muttered. They look like us. The platoon sergeant barked an order. Search 'em. Take their belts and canteens. No rough stuff. The Americans moved cautiously. The Germans obeyed in silence. Karl watched as an American medic offered one of his comrades a drink. He'd expected mockery, maybe cruelty. Instead, the water was clean and cold. The American even smiled a small, weary smile and said something that sounded like, "You'll be all right, buddy." That was the moment the propaganda began to unravel. Back in Germany, Karl had been told that Americans were barbaric, that prisoners were tortured or shot. He'd been taught that the decadent democracies were weak and selfish. But now he saw soldiers who shared cigarettes with their captives, who offered them food, white bread, soft and fresh, something he hadn't tasted in months. He bit into it cautiously, expecting some trick. Instead, he tasted flour and salt and kindness. A fellow prisoner whispered in disbelief, "If this is captivity, I can live with it." Searchlights swept across the horizon, illuminating endless lines of captured soldiers, Germans, Italians, even a few Austrians. They sat in silence, staring at the stars, waiting for orders that would decide their futures. An American lieutenant approached their group with a clipboard. Names, he said curtly, gesturing to an interpreter. Each man stepped forward, gave his name, rank, and unit. When Karl's turn came, the lieutenant studied him for a moment and asked, "You fight for Rommel?" Karl hesitated. "Yeah," the officer nodded. "Hell of a soldier, that man. Too bad he was on the wrong side." It wasn't mockery, it was respect. And that confused Karl more than anything else. Over the next few days, the captured men were herded into larger camps under canvas. The Americans called them PW enclosures, prisoner of war collection points. Conditions were rough but orderly. Each man received rations, tinned meat biscuits, coffee, even cigarettes. Officers were separated from enlisted men, but all were treated according to the Geneva Convention, something the Germans themselves had often ignored in Russia. Rumors spread like wildfire. "Do you know where they're taking us?" "They say America. Across the ocean. America." No, impossible. But within a week, the rumors became truth. On May 15th, Karl and thousands of others were marched toward the port of Oran, Algeria. There, anchored offshore, were gray Liberty ships flying the U.S. flag. Their decks were stacked with crates, their hulls dark and wide, ships built to carry machines of war across the Atlantic, now filled with the men who had built the Reich's illusion of invincibility. As Karl boarded, he turned for one last look at the African coast, the dust, the palms, the fires still burning on the horizon. He thought of the Führer's speeches about honor, destiny, and empire. They seemed distant now, hollow echoes swallowed by the sea. Below deck, the air was stifling. Men lay shoulder to shoulder, stripped of weapons, but not yet of pride. Someone began to hum a tune, Lily Marlene. Others joined softly, their voices filling the darkness like a prayer. Joe Dawson, up on deck, heard it drift through the ventilation grates. He paused, cigarette in hand, and listened. The same song that German soldiers had sung under the stars in Africa was now echoing beneath the hull of an American ship bound for New York. He exhaled a long stream of smoke and muttered, "Hell, maybe we ain't that different after all." Some feared labor camps, others imagined icy isolation or humiliation. But none of them, not Carl, not the officers, not even the Americans escorting them, could have predicted what they would actually find: clean beds, 3 meals a day, baseball games, music, and most dangerously of all, kindness. The desert had taken their weapons. America would take their hatred. May-June 1943, the Liberty ship. Benjamin Hawkins groaned under the weight of its strange cargo. 200 prisoners of war guarded by 24 young Americans who barely remembered to think of them as the enemy. The ocean around them stretched to infinity, dark blue by day, silver black by night. Every man aboard knew that beneath the calm water still lurked U-boats, German submarines, hunting their own countrymen, unaware that some of those very countrymen were prisoners in the belly of an American freighter. Down in the holds, the air was hot, thick with sweat and salt. Rows of bunks made from rough pine boards lined the walls. Hammocks swayed with every roll of the ship. The smell of diesel and wet canvas clung to everything. German voices murmured through the dim light, cautious, subdued. The sound was not of soldiers, but of men unsure whether they were still enemies or something else entirely. Karl Weber lay on his bunk, staring at the low steel ceiling inches above his face. His hands were blistered, his uniform torn at the elbows. Across from him sat Hans Gruber, a 27-year-old corporal from Munich, sketching on the back of a ration wrapper. "What are you drawing?" Karl asked quietly. Hans smiled faintly. "Home, the river near my mother's house. I can't remember what the color of the trees was anymore." "Green," Karl said. "Always green." Hans nodded. "Maybe in America they have trees like that." A guard's voice called down through the hatch, "Mess time. Form up. Keep it orderly, fellas." The word fellas caught Karl's attention. The tone wasn't that of a captor, more like a bus driver trying to keep a crowd calm. On deck, lines of Germans shuffled forward to receive metal trays. The smell of food, real food, drifted through the sea air, thick stew with meat chunks, white bread, even coffee. The cooks, mostly American Navy boys in sweat-stained t-shirts, moved briskly, but without malice. One of them, a red-haired kid with freckles, grinned as he ladled stew into bowls. "Don't spill it. It's the good stuff today." A German sergeant looked at his portion, then at the cook, then muttered in disbelief. "Better than the front." The cook raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" the interpreter nearby translated, and the cook laughed. "Well, hell, maybe you should have surrendered sooner." Even the guards laughed. The Germans smiled nervously, not sure whether they were being mocked or welcomed. That night a storm rolled in. The sea heaved like a living thing, lifting the ship and slamming it down in rhythms that sent buckets and tin cups clattering. Men retched in the dark. Others gripped the bunks, whispering prayers in German. The lights flickered as lightning flashed through the portholes, painting the hold in ghostly blue-white bursts. Up on deck, Joe Dawson stood watch beside the machine gun mount, rain lashing his face. The convoy stretched into the distance, 50 ships in a line, their navigation lights glowing faintly through the squall. He'd been briefed if a U-boat hit one of the ships, no stopping for survivors. Too dangerous. He thought about the Germans below deck, men like him, seasick and scared, and shuddered. He'd seen plenty of enemy corpses in Africa. He didn't want to see any floating in the Atlantic. "Hell of a way to fight a war," his sergeant said beside him, lighting a cigarette beneath his poncho. Joe nodded. "Yeah, they don't look much like Nazis down there. They're all Nazis to somebody, kid. To me, they just look hungry." The sea was calm again, impossibly calm, as though nothing had happened. A pod of dolphins followed in the ship's wake, and for a few minutes the prisoners pressed against the rail, pointing and laughing like children. It was the first time any of them had laughed since capture. One of the guards, seeing their faces, murmured, Guess even dolphins don't care what side you're on. The monotony of the voyage began to dissolve the boundaries of enmity. Guards and prisoners exchanged words through translators, then without them broken English, broken German gestures that said more than words. A few Americans even traded cigarettes for sketches or carved trinkets the Germans made from scrap wood. Hans carved a tiny horse from a piece of crate board and handed it to Joe one afternoon. "For luck," he said. Joe smiled and put it in his breast pocket. "Thanks, Hans. Maybe I'll need it where we're going." Hans tilted his head. "And where is that?" Joe hesitated. "A place called Texas." Hans blinked. "Texas? What is that?" Joe chuckled. "You'll find out. Big sky, big land, and if you behave, maybe big stakes." Hans turned the word over in his mouth, Texas, and smiled faintly. "Sounds like a myth." The sea was calm, the weather mild. A chaplain aboard the ship held an evening service on deck open to all. The Americans formed one group, the Germans another. But as the chaplain read Psalm 23, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death," the voices began to blend. Two languages, one prayer. Even the wind seemed to still. When the hymn ended, there was silence, the kind that carried meaning too heavy for words. 3 days later, land appeared on the horizon. At first, just a gray smear in the mist. Then, as the morning brightened, the skyline of New York City rose from the haze, spires of steel and glass gleaming above the water. The Germans crowded the railings, staring in disbelief. Many had never seen a skyscraper before. Hans whispered, "So this is what the war was against." Carl said nothing. He just stared wide-eyed as the Statue of Liberty came into view, her torch glinting in the sun. One of the Americans muttered, "Bet they didn't expect to see that this soon." As the Liberty ship moved past the harbor, the prisoners stood in stunned silence. They'd been told America was decadent, chaotic, weak. But from the deck, what they saw was power, industry, freedom, and a world that didn't look like it needed conquering. The war had taught them to see enemies. The voyage across the Atlantic had begun to show them people, and soon they would see something even stranger, that captivity could feel more human than freedom. June 1943. Camp Shanks, New York. When the Liberty ship SS Benjamin Hawkins nudged into the dock at Pier 90, the sound of New York was like another kind of battle horns, gulls shouting longshoremen, the deep drone of tugboats. For many of the Germans packed along the railing, this was the first time they had heard laughter that wasn't nervous or desperate. The air smelled not of dust or cordite, but of gasoline-baked bread and coffee drifting from the harbor buildings. "Raus!" Schnell shouted, a German officer, out of habit, then stopped himself, remembering he no longer gave orders. The Americans on deck didn't bark. They organized, calling prisoners by number, moving them into neat ranks on the pier. Private Joe Dawson watched the line form, cigarette tucked behind his ear. The German prisoners, many still in faded Afrika Korps tunics or makeshift field clothes, squinted in the bright morning sun. Joe had imagined bringing prisoners home would feel triumphant. Instead, he felt a strange pity. They looked lost men stepping into a world that had moved on without them. The Germans were processed at Camp Shanks, a sprawling embarkation and transit base 30 miles up the Hudson. It was surrounded by barbed wire, but not much more than that. Rows of wooden barracks stretched in every direction, each with a flagpole, a mess hall, and a signboard with English instructions printed in phonetic German beneath Meldestell report, here. Küche kitchen. Arbeit, work detail. For Karl Weber, it was surreal. He'd spent months sleeping in foxholes, hiding from aircraft, strafing runs, living on half rations. Now at Camp Shanks, he was handed a towel, a bar of soap, and a clean bunk. The mattress smelled of detergent. The sheets were white. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at it, like it was some kind of trick. "Dinner's at 1700, said a sergeant through an interpreter. "If you behave, you'll get cigarettes after." Carl nodded numbly. Cigarettes, dinner, words that sounded ordinary and yet miraculous. Down the corridor, someone was laughing, an American, and a prisoner talking over a deck of playing cards. In the mess hall, the first meal set the tone: mashed potatoes, green beans, roast beef with gravy bread and apple pie. A few Germans hesitated, afraid it might be a test. One whispered, "It's propaganda food, just for today." But the next day and the day after, it was the same. By the third week, the disbelief began to fade into something more dangerous: comfort. The routine was precise, almost military in its orderliness. Reveille at 0600. Breakfast. Roll call. Work detail or recreation. Evening lectures or films. The U.S. Army followed the Geneva Convention of 1929 strictly, partly out of principle, partly because they wanted to set an example for how their own men should be treated in German camps. Prisoners received small wages, 50 cents a day, and canteen coupons for labor. They could buy toiletries, stationery, even postcards to send home. Karl wrote his first one that week, carefully printing in German, "Dear Mother, I am alive and in good health. We are treated well. The Americans give us food, work, and respect. Please do not worry." He hesitated before the last sentence, then underlined it. He wanted her to believe it, but he also wanted to believe it himself. By July, the first trainloads of prisoners were dispatched inland. The United States didn't have enough guards to keep them all near ports, and besides, the war economy needed hands. So the Germans were divided into groups of several hundred and sent to temporary branch camps in places they had never heard of: Camp Hereford, Texas; Camp Algona, Iowa; Camp Stark, New Hampshire; Camp Papago Park, Arizona. When Karl's group boarded the train, he was stunned by what he saw through the window. Endless farmland. Green fields dotted with white houses, children waving at the passing cars. He turned to Hans Gruber and said quietly, "It doesn't look like a country at war." Hans nodded. "Maybe that's why they're winning." The first thing they noticed was the silence. No air raid sirens, no bombers, no explosions, just the wind moving through the grass. The camp commandant, Major Robert Preston, met them at the gate. He was tall, polite, and precise in his manners. "Welcome to Tonkawa," he said through the translator. "You are prisoners, but you will be treated as men. Follow our rules, and we will respect yours." It was not a greeting any of them had expected from a victorious enemy. Within a week, Karl was assigned to work detail 27 agricultural labor on nearby farms. Each morning, trucks rolled out from the gates with teams of prisoners flanked by a single armed guard. They wore blue denim overalls stenciled PW in large yellow letters. At first they drew stares and suspicion, but soon something remarkable began to happen. The farmers who hired them brought cold water, lemonade, even sandwiches. Some offered shade breaks under their porches. One farmer's wife, a woman named Mary Patterson, left a plate of cookies on a fence post. When Karl hesitated, unsure if it was meant for them, then said, "Eat. You're working hard, aren't you?" It was a small act, a few cookies in the heat of an Oklahoma afternoon, but it marked the first real contact between enemies that didn't involve surrender or weapons. That evening back in camp, Hans muttered over his dinner tray, "They treat us better than our officers ever did." A guard overheard and laughed. "Maybe you should stick around, Hans." Hans smiled faintly. "Maybe I will." The men around him chuckled, but not entirely in jest. Because for the first time since the war began, the idea didn't sound like treason. It sounded like hope. Oklahoma, summer, 1943, the days in Camp Tonkawa settled into a rhythm that felt almost peaceful, almost dangerous in its normality. Reveille at dawn, breakfast in the mess hall, roll call under the Oklahoma sun, work assignments pinned to a corkboard near the gate. To men who had lived through the chaos of North Africa, it felt like a dream or maybe a trap. But as the weeks passed, they began to realize something extraordinary. The Americans really meant it. They were not being starved, beaten, or humiliated. They were being managed, and more than that, they were being humanized. Karl Weber awoke one morning to the sound of laughter outside his barracks. A group of prisoners were playing soccer with a ball made of rags and string, their blue denim uniforms already stained with dust. An American guard leaned against the fence watching. When the ball rolled near him, he picked it up, grinned, and kicked it back, a perfect pass that drew cheers. "Not bad, Yank," someone shouted in broken English. The guard tipped his helmet and laughed. "Guess I should have gone pro." Karl stood in the doorway, sunlight slanting across the floorboards. For the first time in months, the sound of laughter didn't feel foreign. The camp itself was almost a small town, rows of long wooden barracks, a canteen, a library, even a stage for performances. A notice board near the mess posted camp newspapers printed in both English and German, filled with news of the war, censored, of course, and stories of POW theater productions. There were English classes, technical workshops, even lectures from visiting professors. Under the Geneva Convention, the United States was required to provide intellectual and cultural opportunities for prisoners. The camp commandant, Major Preston, took that rule seriously. Keep their minds busy, he told his staff. Idle soldiers are dangerous soldiers. They were officers proud of their discipline, still loyal to Hitler and the Reich. They refused to sing American songs or attend English lessons. They called the others weaklings or traitors. But that kind of loyalty began to crumble when hunger and fear were replaced by full stomachs and boredom. The guards noticed it first. The ones who give us trouble are the true believers, one sergeant said. The rest just want to get through the day. In the evenings after dinner, music drifted from the barracks, harmonicas, makeshift guitars, and songs like Lily Marlene or Silent Night. The Americans listened from the guard towers. Some even hummed along. One afternoon in July, Carl's work detail was sent to harvest wheat on the Patterson farm 30 minutes from the camp. The truck rattled down dirt roads through seas of gold. When they arrived, Mr. Patterson, a tall, broad man in a straw hat, greeted them with a nod. "You boys ever cut wheat?" he asked. Carl hesitated. Yes. Before war, good. Then you'll know what to do. My sons are both overseas, so I'm glad for the help." The prisoners worked quietly under the sun, scythes swinging stalks falling in rhythmic waves. At noon, Mrs. Patterson appeared with pitchers of cold lemonade and ham sandwiches. She poured each man a glass, smiling as though they were hired hands, not enemies. Carl took his drink, unsure how to react. She noticed his hesitation. "You don't have to thank me," she said softly. "Just drink. It's hot work." That night back in camp, Carl couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the sound of her voice, kind, weary human. It was the first time in years he'd been spoken to without suspicion or command. In late August, the camp hosted its first theater night. The prisoners built a stage from lumber scraps and painted backdrops with leftover house paint. They performed Goethe, Schiller, even comedy sketches that made the guards laugh. When Major Preston saw the crowd, guards and prisoners sitting side by side on wooden benches, he remarked quietly, "Strangest war I ever fought." Hans Gruber had volunteered as stage manager. After the performance, he found Preston backstage. "Major," he said, "may I ask something?" "Go ahead. Why do you let us do this? We are your prisoners." Preston thought for a moment. "Because someday one of you might be running Germany again, and I'd rather you remember this than the battlefield." Hans stood there silently, realizing that a man could win a war not only with bombs, but with decency. By autumn, something remarkable had begun to happen. The guards no longer carried their rifles everywhere. Fences were still there, but few prisoners tried to escape. Why would they? Beyond the wire lay miles of farmland, where the nearest town's sheriff was more likely to invite them to church than shoot them. The prisoners started trading handmade crafts for soap pencils, even American magazines. Some learned enough English to joke with guards. Others started small gardens behind their barracks, growing flowers and vegetables, proof that they could make something grow in foreign soil. One guard, writing in his diary, put it simply, "These fellas came here Nazis. Now they're just men who miss home." A handful of die-hard Nazis in the camp began organizing secret meetings preaching loyalty to the Führer. They warned others that America's kindness was a trick of the enemy, that mercy itself was propaganda. The commandant knew about them, but chose caution. "We'll win more with patience than punishment," he told his staff. He was right. By winter, their influence faded not by force, but by comparison. Because while they whispered about betrayal, the rest of the prisoners were discovering coffee jazz music and Saturday baseball games on the camp radio. Carl often thought about how strange it was he'd come to America as a prisoner, yet he felt freer here than he ever had in the Reich. No Gestapo, no speeches, no fear of saying the wrong thing. Sometimes when the sun set over the wheat fields, painting the sky gold and violet, he would think, if this is the enemy, what have we been fighting for? Autumn 1943, Heartland, America. The Oklahoma summer faded into harvest season. The air grew cooler, the sky clearer, the land changing from gold to rust and brown. By then, the German prisoners had become a familiar sight to farmers and townspeople. Blue denim overalls marked PWU in bold yellow paint, climbing in and out of army trucks at dawn. What had begun as suspicion in June had softened into curiosity by September. The war still raged overseas, but here in the heartland, the enemy no longer carried a rifle. He carried a shovel. The routine was simple, but exhausting. Load up at 0600. Ride 30 miles to a work site. Pick cotton, harvest wheat, or clear irrigation ditches under the watchful eye of a single American guard. The guards were rarely harsh. Many were older men reservists or veterans of the Great War, whose patience came from experience rather than fear. Some days when the work went well, they even helped. On the Miller farm outside Enid, Oklahoma, Carl Weber found himself working alongside the farmer himself. "Morning, boys," Miller said, stepping out from his truck, wiping grease from his hands. "We'll get the corn in before the frost if we're lucky." Carl nodded, unsure how much English the man expected him to know. Miller pointed at the horizon. "Storm's coming Friday. Let's make the most of it." There was no hatred in his tone, just the business of surviving another season. By mid-morning, sweat drenched every shirt. The prisoners moved in rhythm, gathering stalks into piles while the wind carried the scent of earth and rain. At noon, Mrs. Miller arrived with a pot of stew and cornbread. She handed each man a tin bowl, her eyes kind but firm. "Eat, you'll need strength," she said. When one of the Germans hesitated, she added, "Don't worry, I didn't poison it." They laughed awkwardly at first, then genuinely. For the Americans, these exchanges were small acts of charity. For the prisoners, they were revelations. That night back at camp, Hans Gruber tried to describe it. "She made me stew. She didn't have to. Her son could be fighting in Italy, maybe even against me," Carl said softly. "Maybe she knows war doesn't have to make enemies of everyone." He noticed that productivity on farms with POW labor had doubled since June. The local Chamber of Commerce sent a letter of thanks. Even newspapers began to shift tone, referring to the prisoners not as Nazis, but as the Germans. Preston clipped one headline for his office wall, "Enemy hands help harvest." He understood what few did then, that victory wasn't just about destroying an army. It was about rebuilding the idea of civilization in its wake. There were moments of strangeness, too. In one small town, a POW work crew was invited to help repair a church steeple that had been damaged in a storm. The priest, a gray-haired man named Father O'Donnell, greeted them in broken German. "God welcomes all labor." After the work was done, he offered them lemonade and said a short prayer for peace. Several prisoners crossed themselves instinctively, surprising even themselves. The guard on duty, a man named Sergeant Leland, wrote later in his journal, "I looked at them kneeling beside our folks and thought, hell, if this is what surrender looks like, maybe peace has already started." They washed their clothes, cooked small treats on stoves made from tin cans, and listened to the camp radio. American swing music played almost every night. Glenn Miller, Benny Goodman, the Andrews Sisters. Some of the men laughed at first. "Decadent music," muttered one of the older officers. But within a week, they were humming along. By October, a few had even learned to dance, though poorly in boots too heavy for rhythm. One guard, amused, brought a gramophone into the yard and let them play it during breaks. As the trumpet riffs echoed across the wire, even the most stoic faces softened. Hans carved a small sign from scrap wood and nailed it above the barracks door. "Die Musik rettet uns." Music saves us. There was work beyond farming, too. In Kansas, groups of German POWs helped build roads and irrigation canals. In Louisiana, they loaded lumber and repaired bridges damaged by floods. Everywhere they went, they saw a kind of America that propaganda had never described, a land of work, not ideology. Carl once asked his guard, "Why you fight so hard if you already have everything?" The man shrugged. "To make sure we keep it." It was a simple answer, and maybe that's why it struck him so deeply. Not all days were peaceful. There were occasional fights, usually between prisoners themselves. Some of the diehards, accused others of becoming Americanized. One night, an argument in Barracks 6 turned violent when a Nazi loyalist called a fellow soldier a verrater traitor. The fight ended only when guards intervened. Afterward, Major Preston gathered the men and said plainly, "In this camp, there are no Nazis. There are only men waiting to go home alive. Remember that." His words spread like an unspoken order. From then on, the swastika armbands that a few had hidden in their bunks quietly disappeared. Winter came early that year. Snow dusted the fields. The guards brought coffee instead of water to the work details. The prisoners, wrapped in donated coats, shoveled paths and sang Christmas hymns under their breath. For many of them, this would be the strangest Christmas of their lives, not at home, not free, yet more peaceful than any winter in Germany since 1939. They were prisoners, yes, but prisoners who had begun to feel what freedom might actually mean. Late in December, Hans said to Karl, as they watched the first flakes fall outside the barracks, "I thought America would break us. Instead, it's teaching us how to live." Karl nodded slowly. Maybe that's how they win. Winter, 1943-1944, the first snow had already melted when the war's strangest friendships began. In the heartland of America, far from the beaches of Normandy or the ruins of Stalingrad, German prisoners of war found themselves living among the very people they'd been told were monsters. And to their astonishment, those monsters greeted them not with rifles, but with handshakes, coffee, and sometimes even kindness that felt impossible to explain. By early 1944, work details like Karl Weber's were fully integrated into rural life. Trucks marked PW rolled into small towns every morning, their cargo of captured soldiers heading to orchards, factories, and farms. Children pointed at them with wide eyes. Old men tipped their hats. And women, many of them alone with husbands or sons overseas, regarded the prisoners with quiet curiosity. At first, strict rules forbade direct contact between civilians and POWs. But rules have a way of softening when people meet face to face. On one gray morning in January, Karl's team was sent to repair fences on the Patterson farm, the same family who'd offered lemonade the previous summer. When they arrived, Mrs. Patterson greeted them with a nod. "You boys know your way around wire by now," she said, smiling faintly. Her husband George was away on a business trip. She managed the place with her teenage daughter Clara, who watched the prisoners from the porch, with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Karl noticed her glance at him once or twice, then quickly look away. That afternoon, while fixing a broken gate near the barn, Karl's glove tore open, slicing his palm on the barbed wire. He hissed and wiped the blood on his trousers. "Mrs. Patterson hurried over, alarmed. You all right?" He nodded. "Is nothing. Little cut. Nonsense. Come on inside." He froze. Inside, a prisoner wasn't supposed to enter an American home, but she had already turned, waving him to follow. Inside, the warmth and smell of bread made his head spin. The kitchen was small, tidy, with photographs pinned to the wall, a young man in uniform smiling beside a tractor. Her son Karl realized. "Mrs. Patterson washed his hand with peroxide and wrapped it with gauze. There," she said. "You'll live." He looked at her confused. "Why you help me? I am enemy." She paused. "You're somebody's son too." But something inside him shifted, a crack in the wall that years of war had built. He began to understand that the kindness of ordinary Americans wasn't a trick or propaganda. It was a kind of quiet strength, one that didn't need parades or slogans. Encounters like his weren't rare. In Iowa, POWs working at canning plants were occasionally invited to church picnics under guard supervision. In Georgia, a group of prisoners joined local volunteers in sandbagging a levee during a flood, earning applause when the river finally receded. And in Texas, farmers sent Christmas cards to POWs thanking them for their help in the fields. The U.S. government frowned on such fraternization, but the war had stretched America's humanity across an ocean, and it proved surprisingly elastic. Hans Gruber, always the artist, had been reassigned to the Camp Tonkawa carpentry shop. He carved wooden toys for local children as part of the Red Cross Holiday Relief Program. Each toy, a horse, a train, a tiny airplane, bore his initials burned discreetly on the bottom, HG. One morning, an American chaplain stopped by the workshop and watched him work. "You make these for the kids?" he asked. Hans nodded. "Yes, for your children." The chaplain smiled. "You ever think of making one for your own?" Hans paused. "My home is gone. My town bombed. There is no child left to play with my toys." The chaplain said nothing. He simply rested a hand on Hans's shoulder. It was the first human touch Hans had felt since capture that wasn't a shove or a command. As the months passed, some of the guards began to see the prisoners as workers more than captives. When snowstorms hit in February, the lines between duty and decency blurred completely. At Camp Algona in Iowa, the power went out for 3 days. Guards and prisoners alike huddled in the mess hall, taking turns feeding the pot-bellied stove. A guard named Corporal James Harper later wrote to his wife, "Funny thing, Mary, I spent last night sharing coffee with a German sergeant. We talked about our mothers, our farms, even the cold. He said it was just like home except we were supposed to be killing each other." Some townspeople protested the presence of POWs nearby. They called it an insult to our boys overseas. Local newspapers sometimes ran editorials demanding stricter conditions. But others saw something bigger happening, a quiet transformation that no one had planned. A letter to the editor in the Enid Tribune read, "If these boys go home knowing that America treated them fair, maybe someday the world will remember us for mercy as well as might." It was signed simply, "A farmer's wife." When work crews left the gate, there were no escape attempts, only nods and polite waves between guards and farmers. The prisoners earned small wages enough to buy tobacco paper or the occasional bar of chocolate from the canteen. Every payday, Carl would buy postcards printed with American landscapes, wheat fields, trains, city skylines, and send them home to Germany. On one he wrote, "Mother, I never believed the enemy could be kind. They work us, but they feed us. They are proud, but not cruel. I think now that maybe the war was never between men, only between the words that fooled them." He didn't know if the letter would reach her, but the act of writing it felt like reclaiming a piece of himself. That April, a new guard arrived, a young sergeant from Detroit named Bill Harris. He spoke a few words of German and carried himself with a quiet authority. On his first day, he gathered the prisoners and said, "I won't treat you like animals. Don't make me regret it." Carl approached him afterward and said in halting English, "We not animals, Sergeant. Just men, far from home." Harris smiled. "Then let's make sure we all get home alive." And in that moment, beneath the vast, forgiving sky of Oklahoma, a silent pact formed between captor and captive. Not of war, not of ideology, but of shared humanity born in the unlikeliest of places. Spring 1944. By spring of 1944, the fields around Camp Tonkawa shimmered green again. The snow had vanished, the air was full of birds and the smell of tilled soil. And inside the fences, something remarkable had taken root, not just crops, but community. The Germans had begun to make the camp their own. They built small benches outside the barracks, painted murals on the mess hall walls, and even organized a choir that sang on Sundays. To outsiders, it looked surreal, captured soldiers turning a prison camp into a village. But for men who had lived through years of destruction, creation itself was an act of rebellion against despair. The morning bugle sounded as usual. Karl Weber stood in line at the chow hall, holding his tin tray, the sun cutting sharp across the yard. The menu never changed much: oatmeal bread, sometimes powdered eggs, but nobody complained. It was warm, it was plenty, and it was honest food. Across from him, Hans Gruber was sketching on a napkin, his pencil smudging gray lines into the rough paper. "What is it this time?" Karl asked. Hans smiled faintly. A gate, yes. The one at my house. My father built it when I was a boy. I used to think it was the edge of the world." Karl watched as Hans added careful detail, the hinges, the shadow of vines curling around the posts. For a moment, the camp vanished. That afternoon, the prisoners were assigned to a new project, constructing storage sheds for a nearby Air Corps supply depot. It was hard work, but the pay was slightly better, and it meant working alongside American laborers for the first time. The guards, wary but trusting, allowed them to use proper tools. When Karl hoisted a plank, an American foreman named Joe Dugan called out, "Hey, Kraut, you ever build a barn before?" Karl straightened, uncertain if it was mockery. Yes, he replied simply. Dugan grinned. Good. Then grab that hammer, we've got 6 more to go. By sunset, the men were working shoulder to shoulder, swapping words in broken English and German. When the last nail went in, Dugan slapped Karl on the back. Not bad, Fritz. You work like you own the place. Karl smiled. No, Joe. But maybe one day I will build again. Some prisoners still hoped for a German counterstrike. Others just wanted the war to end, no matter who won. They were soldiers, not politicians. They had seen too much death to still care about flags. Hans, always the philosopher, said quietly, maybe it's not defeat that frightens me. It's what comes after when the killing stops, and we have to remember what we did. Karl looked at him and nodded. The Americans, they don't hate us. That makes it worse somehow. Because they should. The prisoners were allowed to hold their own church services. The camp chapel was a simple wooden hut, but they decorated it with pine branches and a hand-carved crucifix made from scrap wood. Even some American guards attended, sitting quietly in the back. One Easter morning, a chaplain read from the Gospel of Luke, then paused and said, We are all prisoners, in one way or another, of anger, of pride, of the past. But freedom begins the moment we forgive. The words lingered long after the service ended. That afternoon, the camp choir sang Jesu Joy, of man's desiring, the voices of captured men rising over the plains, like a prayer to no one and everyone at once. By May, the fences seemed almost symbolic. The guards trusted the men so much that one morning when the camp truck broke down, they asked for volunteers to push it back to the motor pool. Half the camp showed up. Hell, one corporal muttered, laughing, if they wanted to escape, they'd be halfway to Kansas by now. But none of them ran. They had nowhere to go, and besides, for the first time in years, they didn't want to run. The transformation wasn't unnoticed. The War Department sent inspectors to evaluate morale and discipline at the POW sites. Their report on Tonkawa read, excellent conduct, productive labor, positive relations with civilian populace. Prisoners appear in good health and express no hostility toward captors. To some in Washington, that sounded almost suspiciously good. But to the men living behind those fences, it was simply reality. The United States, in its strange, contradictory way, was waging psychological warfare, not through fear, but through decency. And it was working. One evening in June, as lightning rolled across the horizon, Karl and Hans sat outside their barracks watching the sky split with light. Thunder rumbled like distant artillery. Karl said, You know what I miss most? The sound of my mother's kitchen. Not the food, the sound. The plates, the small noises that mean life is normal. Hans smiled. You'll hear it again one day. Karl shook his head. Maybe not, but maybe something like it. They sat in silence for a while. Then Hans said, When this is over, if they let us go home, I think I will come back here. To America. Karl laughed softly. They will never let you. Hans looked toward the lightning again. Maybe they will. They're strange people, these Americans. They fight like wolves and forgive like priests. Karl nodded. Maybe that's why they'll win. For a few moments, the barracks were plunged into darkness. Then one by one, candles were lit, small flickering flames casting long shadows across wooden walls. Through the downpour came the faint sound of the camp choir voices rising from the chapel, Dona nobis pacem. Grant us peace. Inside his bunk, Karl whispered the words with them, unsure if he was praying or remembering. Summer 1944. The Oklahoma wind carried the smell of summer wheat, and the camp, now almost 2 years old, moved like a living machine. Steady routine, almost peaceful. But one morning in July 1944, that rhythm broke. The mail truck arrived, and with it letters from Germany. The guards tossed the bundle onto the camp office table. It was heavy, nearly 200 envelopes, each marked with censor stamps, smudged ink, and the faint scent of another continent. Major Preston read out the first names from a clipboard as the prisoners lined up. Karl Weber. Karl stepped forward, hands trembling slightly. He hadn't received a letter since 1943, since Tunisia, before he'd been captured in the chaos of Kasserine Pass. The envelope was thin, the handwriting instantly familiar. His mother's. He waited until he was back in the barracks before opening it. The paper was rough brownish, printed with the stamp of German military censors. My dearest Karl, your last letter reached us in March. We were overjoyed to know you live. The town is changed, bombed often, but we endure. The bakery was destroyed, but Frau Lehmann still sells bread when there is flour. Your sister works for the post now. Your father says little but keeps your photo by the stove. We hear strange things about the war. They say you are in America. Is it true? Do they treat you well? I pray you have food and warmth. Do not be ashamed of where you are, my son. Sometimes losing one war saves another part of a man's soul. With love, Mother. Karl folded the letter slowly, staring at the ink as though it contained something sacred. Around him, the barracks had gone almost silent, each man lost in his own reunion across paper and distance. Some laughed, some wept openly. Others read their letters twice, then tucked them under pillows like relics. Hans Gruber sat by the window, his hands shaking. His letter was short, 2 sentences. Hans, our home in Dresden is gone. We are alive. Do not worry. No love, no mother. Just survival. Hans stared out at the wheat fields shimmering in the distance and said quietly, "It feels like I live in 2 worlds, one made of ashes and one made of sunlight." Karl nodded. Maybe that's the price of being lucky. The guards didn't hide it. They pinned a newspaper to the bulletin board near the mess hall. Big black headlines screamed, "Allies land in France." The prisoners crowded around, scanning the grainy photos of beaches, ships, and tanks. Some were silent. Others argued in low tones. A few of the older officers muttered, "It cannot be true." But most of them, especially the younger men, just looked tired. For Karl and Hans, it meant one thing: the war was changing, and soon the world outside the wire would change with it. That evening, the camp commandant gathered everyone in the yard. Major Preston, his voice steady but grave, said, "You've all heard the news. Europe is burning again. But I'll tell you something, if the war ends soon, it's not because of who has more guns. It's because we finally learned how to use mercy as a weapon. Remember that when you go home." His words hung in the air long after lights out. Even the guards spoke of it later quietly, as if afraid the thought itself might be too bold that kindness could win a war. The letters kept coming throughout the summer, and with them packages, small tins of cookies from the Red Cross bars, of soap photographs. In one photo, a German prisoner's wife stood with their children beside the ruins of their apartment building, smiling weakly at the camera. Another showed a newborn baby, a daughter he had never met. The camp's mood shifted. There was laughter again, but it carried a strange heaviness, as if every joy was weighted with guilt. Hans began painting portraits of the prisoners and guards alike using pigments made from crushed berries and dirt. He painted Karl holding his mother's letter, his expression somewhere between hope and heartbreak. The guards watched him work. One of them asked, "Why paint us?" Hans replied, "Because one day we'll all be gone and someone should remember what mercy looked like." They were gaunt, hollow-eyed men captured in Normandy. Their uniforms were tattered. Their skin burned dark from sun and fear. One of them, a young corporal, barely 20, stared around the camp in disbelief. "This is America," he whispered. Karl nodded. "Yes, they told us prisoners were shot, or sent to the mines." Karl smiled sadly. "No mines here, just too much coffee." The boy laughed for the first time in weeks. But not everyone was content. A few die-hard Nazis among the new arrivals bristled at the relaxed discipline of Tonkawa. They called the older prisoners Feiglinge cowards for cooperating with the Americans. At night, they whispered about escape, about loyalty, about the honor of Germany. One of them, Corporal Werner Schmidt, tried to stir resentment. "You eat their food, you sing their songs," he sneered. "Do you even remember who you are?" Karl looked at him and said quietly, "Yes, I remember. That's why I don't need to hate anymore." The room fell silent. For the first time, the ideology that had fueled the war began to crumble, not from bombs, but from simple decency. By August, the camp's Red Cross liaison reported something remarkable. Prisoners were sending money home, small sums earned from work details converted into marks through international channels. Hans laughed when he received confirmation. Imagine German soldiers funding the rebuilding of German towns with American wages. Karl replied, maybe that's what victory really looks like. The horizon would flicker like artillery, but there was no sound of guns. Only thunder and rain. It became a ritual, a reminder that the sky could still roar without meaning death. One evening, as lightning split the clouds, Hans said, "Do you think they'll let us stay after the war?" Karl chuckled softly. "You mean in America?" Hans nodded. "I would work anywhere. Paint houses, fix fences. Anything. Just not go back to the rubble." Karl didn't answer, but he didn't say no either. A few weeks later, another letter arrived from Germany. It was from Karl's sister this time. "Brother, we hear the Allies are in Paris. The soldiers say the war may end by Christmas. Mother prays for you every night. She says America has made a gentleman out of you." Karl smiled as he read it. Maybe his mother was right. America had made him something else too, something that wasn't just German or soldier or prisoner. It had made him human again, and that he thought might be the most dangerous victory of all. Spring 1945. By March 1945, the world outside the barbed wire was collapsing faster than anyone inside the camp could comprehend. The prisoners gathered around the radio in the mess hall every night, listening to static-laced bulletins about cities falling one after another: Cologne, Koblenz, Frankfurt. The Reich, which once seemed eternal, was now crumbling like a castle of ash. Inside the camp, the Americans didn't cheer. They just nodded quietly, as if witnessing the inevitable. For the prisoners, every new broadcast was a paradox. Each Allied victory meant the war was ending, but also that everything they'd known, everything they'd fought for, was vanishing. Karl Weber had stopped marking days on his bunk post. It no longer mattered. The seasons blurred together, one long rhythm of work meals and reflection. He still repaired fences, still sent letters home, but the man who had arrived in chains in 1943 was not the same man who now stood under the open Oklahoma sky. One morning, while shoveling gravel near the motor pool, a guard called out, "Hey Weber, you hear the news?" Karl wiped the sweat from his forehead. "What news?" Berlin's surrounded. "Russians are in the suburbs. It's almost over." Karl froze. For a moment, the sounds of the camp hammering engines' voices faded away. It's almost over. He thought of his mother, of Dresden's smoking ruins, of the friends he'd buried under olive trees in Tunisia. What did over even mean? That night in the barracks, the men whispered about the future. "Do you think they'll let us go home soon?" To what home, another muttered. "Maybe the Americans will keep us. We can build roads, work farms." Someone laughed softly. "Ja, America could use a few more bakers." Hans Gruber, sitting by the window with his sketchbook, said nothing. He had drawn a picture of the camp fence, the wire curling upward into the sky, dissolving into clouds. At the bottom he'd written a single word: Freiheit. Freedom. Karl leaned over his shoulder. "That's beautiful." Hans smiled faintly. "It's not art. It's a prayer." "Hitler's dead," he said simply. Silence. Then murmurs: disbelief, shock, relief, even sorrow from a few who had worshipped him. For most, it was something else entirely, a quiet, hollow awareness that the war, the ideology, and the nightmare were truly finished. Hans whispered, "So that's how it ends." Not with parades, with silence. He removed his cap, his voice grave but steady. "Men, Germany has surrendered. The war in Europe is over." A long pause. Then, to everyone's astonishment, one of the prisoners began to cry. Not from grief, from release. The sound spread like a contagion. Some dropped to their knees, clutching their heads. Others stood motionless, as if the weight of survival itself had become unbearable. Karl simply stared at the horizon, whispering, "I made it." Red Cross officers arrived, distributing forms and conducting interviews. The U.S. Army began cataloging prisoners for repatriation. Lists were typed, stamped, and posted on bulletin boards. Each name meant a man's departure from the strange sanctuary that had once been a cage. But not everyone wanted to leave. When Hans Gruber's name appeared on the list, he tore the paper down and brought it to Major Preston. "Sir," he said quietly, "please remove me. I don't want to go." Preston looked up from his desk, taken aback. "You don't want to return to Germany?" Hans shook his head. "There's nothing to return to. My home is gone. My family. I would rather stay and work." The major sighed. You know I can't authorize that. Orders are orders. Hans hesitated, then said softly, Then maybe I will come back someday, when the world is sane again. Preston smiled sadly. I hope you do. He had begun to help the camp chaplain translate sermons for the prisoners. On Sundays, he stood at the front of the chapel, reading verses in both German and English. When he wasn't working, he taught English to new arrivals using tattered magazines and military pamphlets. One afternoon, the chaplain found him sitting alone under a tree, staring at a half-finished letter. You'll miss this place, the chaplain said gently. Carl nodded. Yes, and I don't know what that says about me. It says you found peace where you didn't expect to. Carl smiled faintly. Then maybe America won't let me forget it. Each departing group lined up outside the gate, handed back their uniforms, and received travel rations, bread, fruit, canned meat. The guards shook hands with them one by one. When Carl's turn came, Sergeant Bill Harris, the same guard who'd once said he wouldn't treat them like animals, extended his hand. Good luck, Weber. You're a decent man. Don't let anyone tell you different. Carl shook it firmly. And you, Sergeant, if I come back someday, I'll buy you a beer. Harris grinned. Make it 2. As Carl stepped onto the truck, he looked back at the camp, the fences glinting in the morning sun, the chapel roof catching the light, the distant murmur of engines. For 2 years, it had been his prison. Now it felt like his homeland. The convoy rumbled eastward, crossing the plains and the Mississippi, then the Atlantic. Carl kept his mother's letters in his jacket, folded carefully between his pay stubs and an American cigarette card. When the ship finally reached Europe, he stood at the rail watching the gray coastline rise from the mist. Germany lay ahead, broken, burned, barely breathing. But somewhere deep inside he carried something unbroken. Not faith, not loyalty, just the quiet conviction that mercy could rebuild what hatred had destroyed. Months later, when reconstruction began, a letter arrived at Camp Tonkawa. It was addressed to the commandant and men of the camp. The handwriting was elegant, deliberate. Dear sirs, I am home now, if you can call rubble a home. I wanted to thank you not for food or shelter, but for showing us that even war cannot erase decency. Many of us will try to live as you taught us, with fairness, with compassion, and without hate. Please tell Sergeant Harris that I kept my promise. The first beer I had in Leipzig, I drank for him. Yours sincerely, Carl Weber. Major Preston read the letter aloud to the remaining staff. When he finished, the room was silent. Then someone said softly, Guess we did something right after all. Grass grew where guard towers once stood, and every summer since the wind over Tonkawa carries faint echoes of laughter songs and languages that once met there as enemies and left as something far more enduring.